Hello and welcome to today's video. I'm here with Nemo the Mormon, now ex-Mormon because he was recently excommunicated from the church for speaking out and criticizing the Mormon church. So today Nemo's going to share his story. He's going to share what it's like to get excommunicated. If you're familiar with my story, you know that I kind of excommunicated myself when I wrote my name off the records of the church. But Nemo went the other route of getting full-on excommunicated, not just by his local leadership, but his letter was signed by the first presidency, the literal prophet of the church, to kick him out. So, Nemo, if you could introduce yourself and share a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone. My name's Nemo. I'm British, if you can't tell. And I think that's what makes me different in this space. Sam Shelley lost her crown. She's another content creator, and she was the only Brit in the space until I turned up. I grew up in the church. I'm a third generation member of the church. So my grandparents joined the church in the 60s. I had been a member of the church my whole life. And then in 2020, I moved from a position of sort of orthodox membership to more heterodox or unorthodox membership in the church, but I retained my membership. I began to enact things like opposing votes. I began to participate in an opposing vote against the senior leaders of the church because I discovered they weren't being truthful about things. And then ultimately in 2024, September 2024, I was excommunicated because I think the church had enough of my nonsense.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel today. I'm really excited to get your story and just to hear what it's like to get excommunicated. I have never had a conversation with someone who's been excommunicated other than maybe John DeLynn. It's a fairly rare event to get publicly excommunicated. So I'm really interested to hear what that was like. But before we jump into the story of the excommunication, let's discuss what your upbringing was like in the church. I think most people, when they hear Mormon, they think Utah Mormon. They don't think British. So I would love if you would share, third generation, that means you were quite Mormon. What was your upbringing like in the church?
Yeah, I'm never going to be able to claim these like 7, 8, 9 generation Mormon heritages that a lot of people can, where they're like, oh yeah, my grandparents or great great grandparents crossed the plains or whatever it is. I don't have any of that. What I have is sort of what you call second wave British Mormonism. So first wave British Mormonism, there are some families that are as old as families in Utah. Some, very rare, but in the UK, the church has been in the UK since the 1830s. The first foreign mission outside of North America was to the British Isles of the church. So after they sent people up to Canada to try and sell the copyright to the Book of Mormon, which is a whole other story, they sent missionaries. They sent many members of the Quorum of the 12, the top leaders of the Mormon church, were sent to the British Isles to gather converts. And at one point, there was more members of the church outside of America than in it. And it was very early on. There was more Brits members of the church than Americans. The narrative that we learned growing up is that we saved the church.
Wow.
The joke was they may have the promised land, but we were the promised people. In that they came to the UK, and I kid you not, whole villages of people went on these boats. The oldest LDS meeting house in the world is in the UK.
Wow.
It was built in the 1830s. It's either a couple of years older or a couple of years younger than the Kirtland Temple.
The ongoing discussion between BYU being the church's university and BYU Idaho is the Lord's University. It's like everybody wants to claim the chosen people title.
Well, yeah, and so there was that first wave, congregations of thousands with Dan Jones in southern Wales before they would then sail. Tabernacle Choir comes from Welsh choral singing. Welsh converts to the church brought the Tabernacle Choir to... brought it to life. They started it. And so, there's a rich history of Mormonism in the British Isles, but so many people went to the States. Some stayed, but many went to the States. Then polygamy kind of became more known about and was published about in newspapers in the British Isles, and that kind of dried up. But again, some people still joined and started congregations. We have, again, congregations that have been going since the 1830s in the UK.
Wow.
That have continuously been congregations of the church. They're some of the oldest around. And so the second wave came sort of in the time that my grandparents were born, when Mormon missionaries from America, these charming young men, came over and started converting people, not this time for like a life of promise in the United States, but for building up the church in the UK. proper. This was after the Perpetual Immigration Fund. Sorry. The church was encouraging people to emigrate to Utah for a long time, right? And that stopped in about the 50s. So around the time my grandparents were converted was when the church started to rebuild in the UK. And it was a big social scene. We did road shows, putting on performances. There was like the athletics competitions that they do. There was all this stuff going on. So yeah, that was life as a Mormon in the UK through the 70s and 80s when my parents were growing up and dating and all that sort of stuff. And even into my youth.
Yeah, very similar to what was happening with the church over in the United States, which was, everybody unanimously will say the church was just more fun back then. The dances and the events, and the church was just investing a lot more into its own people. And then now it's a lot more austere.
One of the criticisms I get from people is that, Nemo just wants the church to be this big social club. I think here's a fundamental difference, is that I saw what the church could be as a community in the UK for a group of people who didn't have Mormon neighbors, for a group of people who weren't surrounded by Mormons and had to kind of seek each other out and find that community of people with shared values. And that's what I think the church can be, and that's what I was advocating for the church to be still, is a strong social thing. The problem is now a lot of people don't feel they want that from the church, or have accepted they're not going to get it because it's just been dying a death over the years with just the removal of more and more social elements of the church, to the point now where certain individuals can say, well, of course it's not a social club. It's purely focused on a niche religious belief. And I think the church can and should be much more than that, personally.
So then you were born into this third generation. If you could describe, what was your upbringing like in the church?
Yeah, I was one of 6 kids. My auntie had 12 kids. So they really got into that Mormon ethic of like having loads of kids, and we were known for that as kids growing up, the fact that you were part of a big family, and that kind of became connected with being Mormon. That was kind of a known thing. But yeah, I was like the only kid, or one of 2 kids who was a member of the church in my school, maybe 3 at one point. There wasn't really many of us. My ward was 120, 150 people at its largest, and it's now down to like 60, these days. The church is really declining in the UK, but certainly when I was growing up, that was a decent sized ward. I belonged to quite a strong stake, and we still did things like stake athletics. We still did things like stake football competitions, or soccer for the Americans. We did all these things, but there was always a tension. There was always a sort of sense of feeling quite alienated from the world around you. Okay, imagine this: you grow up in Utah, and everyone around you is Mormon. So you feel justified in saying, well, we're right about things, and this is the right way to live, and all that sort of stuff. And you're supported in that by all your neighbors around you. Whereas imagine having that worldview, but not having all those Mormons around you. That's going to kind of alienate you from friends, from social circles. It's going to make you seem quite aloof, quite different. And that's how I would describe my childhood. I wasn't allowed to take religious education classes at school because I got too argumentative about religion.
That's so funny.
they stopped me taking them because I was a good little soldier for Christ.
I also didn't grow up in Utah, so when we lived in Texas, there were a lot of members in my high school, but other than that, in Montana and Kentucky, it was similarly very, I was always one of the only ones, and it is really isolating. And I feel like some kids might take that to be almost a pride thing, where you're proud of being part of this religious tradition and you're really special and we have the truth and they don't. Or you might just feel really lonely. So which of those two, or maybe a third option, was it for you?
I think it was more the first. I tried to convert my friends. One of my friends was a Baptist. We had arguments upon arguments about the Trinity, particularly. I remember those. But yeah, I would get up and do early morning seminary. I'd get up at 5 a.m. I'd ride my bike to the other side of town in, minus degrees in the winter, which is Celsius. It's not as bad as it sounds to the Americans, but it was cold, right?
Yeah.
It was like, 30 or something. And I'd be riding my bike to the chapel to do early morning seminary. And I'd then go to a friend's house and then eat breakfast and then go to school. Yeah, that was my seminary experience. So, and again, I was there. That I was the only kid going to school who was really, really tired in the morning because I just got up for seminary. Yeah, everyone else had slept in.
This is going to be a very American question, but for those who don't know, who are watching, Mormons can't have tea, specifically black and green tea. They can have herbal tea, but not brewed teas is the typical word of wisdom, which what does that even mean? But were you,
Yeah.
I hear there's not a big tea culture in America,
Mhm.
but did that impact you at all socially to not be able to drink tea?
I didn't think it did at the time, but thinking back on it, people must have thought I was odd, because the typical response to most things is a cup of tea. Happy, sad, whatever, like
Oh.
that's the solution. And I was never included in that.
Mm.
So yeah, I guess I was looking back on it, but I didn't feel like it at the time.
Hmm.
Yes.
And did you serve a mission?
Yeah.
Where did you serve, and
Yes.
what was that like?
So my mission was a little bit different. I served as a ordnance worker in the temple.
Oh.
So I was a missionary in the London South mission, but I was assigned to the temple, and I would go out and do some tracting with the office elders who were on site, and I would also do a shift at the temple because the London temple was desperate for workers, and that suited sort of my personal situation a bit better. So yeah, so at the age of 19, I became a temple ordnance worker and got very familiar with the endowment and with the temple.
What was your first experience with the endowment like, if you care to share, or maybe you don't want to,
Yeah, I
whatever.
really liked it. This is
Okay.
again, this is something. I know a lot of people like. I know in your book, for example, you talk about how you really didn't like it and you really wanted to like it. You were trying to be kind of comfortable with it, and I, I was fine with it. I thought it was great. I still would love to go back now.
Wow.
I would love to go back to the temple now, but obviously I wasn't allowed, and we'll get to that part of my story. But yeah, so I really then it was a very formative part of my life. Then constantly being in the temple, I earned nicknames such as John the Baptist because I by other missionaries because I would be there doing baptisms for the dead on the daily, helping out. I remember there was a family they came from somewhere in the Middle East where they didn't have a temple, and they would do family history all the time. So this like 12-year-old boy comes into the temple with a stack of names, and they're there for like a week. So I'm doing like 100 baptisms at a time, and then stepping out the font for a bit, and then going and doing more. And so yeah, I was the highest baptizing missionary in the mission by a fair margin.
It's fairly easy to baptize people who are just names on a card.
It
But
is, but
also,
yeah.
people take it very seriously.
Mhm.
If you obviously believe within the belief system, it is just
Mhm.
as legitimate of a baptism as a living person because
Mhm.
they are on the other side. And I know, so I've talked quite a bit about the endowment on my channel. I've
Mhm.
shared, my personal experience in a lot of videos, but I haven't shared as much about. I also was a temple worker. I did washing and anointing ordinances,
Mhm.
and I also did the veil from time to time. If you could just share a brief summary or explanation of what a temple worker even is doing in as
Mhm.
their role within the temple.
Cool. So you're there to perform the ordinances for people and to facilitate the ordinances happening. So when that's washings and anointings, you'll be in one of the three booths, and you'll receive people in, and you'll pronounce the various blessings upon them as they're necessary, or you'll anoint them, or you'll wash them, whatever it needs to be. One of my big jobs, I was the name issue coordinator, which meant that I had the very special paperwork that had to go to the temple office, but that I'd check off people that had been given the new name and whatnot. I would do that. They'd come into the booth, they'd receive the name for the day, then they'd take that into the endowment so that they know what it is. You'll remember from your time there that the women aren't given the men's name, right? They're sent out of the room, and then the men's name is told. So that's, again, just a little detail there. But yeah, I would work the recommend desk. You'd be there helping people come in, making sure people's recommends are valid so that they can actually enter. And if they're not, calling up to the temple office and sorting that out. Yeah, you're there to facilitate all these ordinances. And there's a lot of running up and down, well, not running, but moving swiftly up and down the stairs. The London Temple has lifts, but I would never use them, or elevators, but I'd never use them. I would always be keeping myself fit and running up and down. So
Yeah, that's for anyone who doesn't understand the use of the word ordinance there. Within
sorry.
Mormondom, no, you're good. Within Mormondom, essentially, an ordinance, just like Christians have baptism, Mormons believe there are many different types of ordinances that are saving ordinances. So, baptism is the
Mhm.
first. There's also the washing and anointing, the endowment, and then what marriages or weddings, temple sealings. temple weddings are all considered
Mhm.
saving ordinances. So the ordinance workers, and I also think people don't realize how much of a logistical nightmare almost temples are, because there
Mhm.
are tons of different ordinances happening on any given day. There's people at the front desk, there's people who need to be doing the finances,
Mhm.
ordering laundry, because there's a lot of laundry involved in temples, because
Mhm.
baptisms or the clothing you wear during the endowment, if you're renting it. So it is a fairly labor intensive thing to run a temple. So
I think I've still got all my shift like assignment sheets where it will say that you're on. So at the end of the endowment ceremony, you receive people through the veil. You receive them through into symbolically the presence of God, and then they go to the celestial room, which are the big opulent rooms in the temple. And there was only so many ordnance workers, but on a Saturday at the London Temple, at least, there was one of those sessions going up every half an hour, and they're about 2 hours long. So that meant then that every half hour there needed to be people at the veil to receive people off to get into the celestial room, and then those people had to be sort of shoved out of the celestial room in time for the next group to come in, and there's all these logistics involved. And so, yeah, sometimes Saturdays would just involve there's two floors in the London Temple. There's the upper rooms and the lower rooms, and it would just involve going up and down the main staircase to go onto this veil. Oh, okay, now room fours needs receiving, and then room two, and then room, and it's just all logistics to get it all done.
yeah, it's so funny. I was listening to an interview with another temple worker, and he was talking about how almost the that working in the temple is, your mind is in stuff like this, which is very logistics
Hmm.
based and potentially not as focused on some of the implications, like you said, of the men getting to know the women and the man's name, and then the
Hmm.
women get sent out, and then the man's name gets told. It's almost because of the organizational structure of the church, similar to what I experienced on my mission.
Hmm.
You're not always questioning the underpinning philosophy of some of the things you're doing as much as you are having your brain really focused on the day-to-day logistics and rules and structures of how do I accomplish this task versus is this the best thing I could be doing with my time?
Well, but I do remember going to a member of the temple presidency and saying to him uh, something to the effect of, "I discovered the similarities between the endowment and masonry at my time at the temple," and I was like, "Oh, I'm not sure about this." And then I went to him with the solution that it was basically just preserved from Solomon's temple, and I think he was just kind of like, "Okay, right, cool. He's come up with his own answer. Let's not let's not push it too far."
He's like,
Um,
how nice the spirit let you know that.
yeah, but I got on really well with them, and my temple president was a guy called Mike Otterson, who people may know as the head of church PR during the time of the
Oh,
November 2015 policy. So there's a video of him sat down with D. Todd Christofferson talking through the policy that got leaked.
mm,
And he was a really nice guy. He showed me the physical copy of the endowment script that they keep in the temple safe. I don't know if you know that they had one of those.
mm-mm.
So there's a physical copy of the endowment script so that in case of mass AV failure and none of the presentation equipment works or anything, they can still do ceremonies in the temple because they have a
Wow.
script they can read from, which is just mad when you think about it.
Yeah, it's the level to which people go through try like my video, it will be posted by this video, but the video I did a few weeks ago was about the second coming, apocalypse, preppers preparing for the second coming, and I
Okay.
encountered this massive spreadsheet with so many tabs where people are really meticulously seeing what is happening in the world astronomically. They're charting wars, they're charting temples, number of missionaries. So they have basically a tab for every single sign that
Sort of
second coming is
metric.
near.
Yeah.
And there are multiple people going in there and carefully writing down, how to know when the second coming is going to happen. And I feel like members of the church are very good at record keeping and at,
Hmm.
everybody thinks the world's going to end. So we need to have physical copies of the endowment so that when the world ends and electricity stops working, we can all still be doing our temple ordinances just like nothing has changed.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me of Kremlinology. Like, that thing they did during the Cold War where they'd look at who sat next to who at like a parade on Red Square and they'd be like, oh, this means that such and such is going on, right? It's almost like that. But what we know about Kremlinology is it's not very reliable at all because it is just guesswork based off very vague clues. And similarly, this prepper idea seems to be guesswork based off very vague clues. People
Yeah.
have been predicting the end of the world for thousands of years,
Yeah.
and it's not happened yet. So
No man knows the
um,
hour, but maybe we can
no.
guess.
And we won't get into the irony that these people are so excited that the end is near that they're neglecting the things that will actually bring about the end of the world, like antibiotic resistance and climate change and all these sorts of things, right? Those don't tend to be high on the agenda
Yeah.
of these sorts of individuals. But we won't get too into that.
So I didn't realize the connections between Mormons and Masonry till I was out of the church. I'm curious if that your first time encountering something that felt incongruent with what had been presented to you as the true church.
Yeah. I'd say that was my first thing that was like out of the box. That was my first thing that was like, okay, no one told me about this before, but I found it on Wikipedia, right? I think I was prepping for a Sunday school lesson or something. Yeah, that was the first time something like that came up.
What went through your head when you were reading the Wikipedia page?
Well, I think that one was pretty open and shut because I grasped onto a sentence somewhere that basically said that the Masons believe, or it's part of their mythos, that it's the secrets of Solomon's temple. And so I just grabbed hold of that. I was like, okay, cool, that explains it, done. Right. So it was pretty cut and shut, but it was the first time anything like that had happened. And the things that really started to get me were things like teaching a 6,000-year-old Earth, things like a literal flood. I started to get uncomfortable with those at university, and I think I lost my literal belief in the Bible as a word-for-word history book around. So that was one of the first things for me that changed about my shift. But that didn't. I think if you froze time in a sacrament meeting right now, anyway, even in deepest Utah, you froze time in a sacrament meeting and you forced people to answer honestly, do you believe in a literal flood? Do you believe the world is 6,000 years old? You'd get plenty of people that would say yes, but you'd also have plenty of people that would say no. So I don't think that in itself made me particularly different than any other member. I think a lot of members go through that, even if they don't ultimately leave the church. I think a lot of members have this shifting of narrative around the literal nature of the Bible and its stories. And, you look at someone like Dan McClellan, he's a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I remember at BYU when my professor, I took, Bio 101 or something, and we started talking about evolution, and the professor basically said, this is what's been discovered scientifically. So he basically in this conversation taught us to have two sides of our logical brain, a spiritual side that is understanding that Adam and Eve did literally exist in a spiritual sense, and they did literally go to Missouri when they stepped out of the Garden of Eden, and this is all still quite literally true, while still being true. The word true is so amorphous because it can mean scientifically true, but it can also mean true in the manner of God's truth, which is better and different than the scientific truth. So we can understand something like evolution scientifically, and we can answer questions on a test and get all the questions right, and we can write papers about evolution. But we also know with this other part of our brain that Adam and Eve is also literally true as well. They're just kind of existing on different planes of truth. And I think that speaks to what you just said about the Bible and a literal flood, which is that it's almost encourages a doublethink that allows you to hold ideas that cannot exist as truth in the same world of logic. But if you can develop multiple ways of viewing truth, then you can hold all these different views and walk through the world and finish your bio class and get A's while still believing in Adam and Eve.
Yeah, well, as I didn't encounter it under those circumstances. I encountered it, again, being a Brit, not being at BYU. I encountered it at university, surrounded. I lived with the head of the Islamic Society, so devout Muslim. I lived with a devout atheist. I lived with a guy who was somewhere in between. And then I lived with another guy who was a climate change denier. So,
wow,
there was a range of views and opinions, and a lot of them were in the debating society. And I learned a lot about critical thinking, about logic, about good arguments, bad arguments, and they really pushed and tested a lot of my apologetics and broke a lot of my self-justifications about the literal historicity of the Bible and things like that. So it's not that I lost my belief in the fundamental doctrines of the church, But like I said, I started to, my view around the Bible certainly started to change, which I think, if a lot of members are honest with themselves, has happened to them too, as they have confronted science and sort of modern reasoning.
So as you are experiencing this, moment with masonry, this moment with the Bible, these conversations with your roommates, how did this begin to shift you toward becoming a more public critic of the church?
So that kind of didn't. That made me a lot more nuanced. And I would teach Sunday school lessons about, before Jordan Peterson became a raving right-wing lunatic, I, found some of his commentaries on the Bible quite helpful in viewing the Bible in a non-literal way. He did a series on Genesis, and I was like, okay, there's some. For me, was there are people out there who are looking at the Bible in a non-literal way, and that was what I started to look at. And so I teach Sunday school lessons, because I became a Sunday school teacher when I got back off my mission and when I got back from university. I've been in Sunday school my entire church life. So I was the secretary on the Sunday school presidency when I was 14. By 19, I was the Sunday school president. Then I went on mission. Then when I came back off my mission, I was the Sunday school teacher, went to university, came back, was put on the Sunday school presidency again, and taught Sunday school. So that's my entire church service has been teaching and speaking,
Okay.
which I think set me up well for what I ended up doing with my life. But yeah, I would teach a lot more symbolic lessons, and it would all point to Jesus, and it would be about the cause of the gospel. And I started to sort of reject a lot of the fluff and a lot of the nonsense and try and keep things very simple. And that's kind of how that impacted me there. But it wasn't until I found out about the church's financial dealings, and I found things like the CES letter, and I found things like Tom Phillips' interview about the second anointing and stuff like that, where I was like, you know what? It's not just that, okay, I'm having to contend with a literal interpretation of the Bible versus a figurative one, which many Christians outside of Mormonism contend with. That's just a broad Christian issue. I'm now having to contend with my specific faith group has demonstrably deceived its members about money. They have lied about money. They have hidden certain things like multiple First Vision accounts. You can see the page where the 1832 account of the First Vision has been stuck back in the Joseph Smith papers, where the church has released all these documents from Joseph Smith's lifetime. You can see an account of the First Vision that differs to the one that we're taught was torn out and has subsequently been put back. So that's when I've really started to lose my... I regret this. I talked at the time on an interview with John Dehlin about just losing my faith and being out of the church and just leaving. And that's how I felt at the time. But then things changed, which we'll get to. And so I think that creates a lot of confusion for people, because I was on the brink of leaving. I was angry. I was upset that I'd been lied to, but I couldn't bring myself to leave.
Yeah, it is interesting in looking back how I think a lot of people experience this I'm so done moment, and then they still go back to it. And I definitely had so many moments of that where I would feel this feeling rising up of I don't want to do this anymore. And then I just wanted it to be true. I wanted to believe. I was I was deeply embroiled in a social group that if I left, I was not going to be able to quickly jump into some other social group. This was my community. So I think I resonate with that a lot, because I think even if you might feel that feeling of I'm ready to be done with this, it's truly can take years, I think, for so many people to actually walk away or to fully be done, versus telling themselves, oh, it sounds like maybe you were in a faith crisis, not a full-on disbelief mode.
Well, yeah, I would rather talk about it now as a trust crisis, right? I lost all my trust in the institution rather than my sort of religious faith. And I saw patterned before me on ex-Mormon Reddit and places like that. Okay, here's what you do. You discover this stuff about the church, so you leave the church and then you move on with your life. And so I kind of almost got just caught up in this sort of wave of, I started to teach things in Sunday school before they released me about more controversial things about the church, right? Because I was discovering this stuff. I was like, I'm just going to talk to people about it. I was info dumping left and right, all those common things. But I was using the vernacular that wasn't quite true to how I really wanted to proceed forward when I kind of stopped and thought about it, which was actually sort of pragmatically, I haven't lost my belief in the restoration so much. I haven't lost my belief in Jesus Christ. I haven't lost those things. I've lost my faith in or trust in this institution, but it still exists pragmatically. And so could it be a better institution? Could it become more honest if someone pointed out the problems? Is that possible? Turns out no, but I had to find that out for myself, I think. So I stuck around. I was still able to answer. Temple recommended a few questions for the most part. I could answer the first questions about my belief in God, my belief in the restoration, but I couldn't sustain the leaders of the church, so I couldn't raise my hand in support of them when we were asked to vote, and I couldn't pay tithing anymore to the church because I realized what they've been doing with our money the whole time.
Yeah, I really wish we could have some sort of internal report about how many people stopped paying tithing. I know there are definitely quite a few people out there who, after that leaked with the SEC violation and just how much money they have and how much even is invested in Apple, how many people just said, I just know logically I need my money more than the church does at this point. And they are obviously not using it to help the sick and afflicted at least as much as I thought they were. So
it's like all actual charities could use my money instead, right?
Yeah. People, people who are saying I can search up charities myself and send my money directly to them. And then at least I know for sure that the charity is getting the money. And also, while we're talking about faith crisis, as we are, I wanted to share before we continue, I have a video that I did with Nemo over on his channel. It's him interviewing me about what it's like to be ex-Mormon. I'll put the link below. This is a screenshot of what the thumbnail looks like. So after you finish this video, please make sure to hop on over to my interview over there and check out Nemo's channel, because he's talked about, especially with the finances of the church, so many interesting videos covering just exactly what the church has done in regards to hiding their billions of dollars.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, if you look at a regular charity, some of the best performing charities in the world, for every dollar you give them, 97 cents on the dollar are used for charitable purposes. And the other, 4 or 3 are used for overheads and the cost of administration, all that sort of stuff, right? For the best charities like GiveWell, a website that monitors these things, will tell you they're really effective. You look at the church, and being the most generous to the church possible, if you accept that $1 billion figure they've been bandying around recently, compared to their income and compared to their other stuff, their figure comes out at the inverse. 14 cents on the dollar is used for charitable purposes, and the rest is used for whatever else.
All.
Right? But in so many countries, they are a charity. They're a registered charity. So that's another thing I think that informs my view of the church differently to Americans, is that in America, you can get tax-free status not just by being a charity, but just by being a religion. You can claim yourself to be a religion, and that's it. You just don't have to pay taxes, if I've understood that correctly. It's pretty simple. Whereas in the UK, you have to be registered as a charity, which means that you are overseen by something called the Charities Commission, which checks what you're doing with the money. You have to file a report. That report is public. We can see in the UK the church's accounts for the UK. At a sort of macro level, we can see what they're spending on employees. We can find out how many people the church employs in the UK that are paid over £60,000 a year. How many are paid this much. We can see a lot of this stuff. And so when I'm talking about the church and my expectations, I think they're informed by my perception as a Brit that the church is not just a religion, it is a charity. And so it should be doing charitable good. And if it isn't, that's a problem for me. Whereas I think some Americans are like, well, of course it's not a charity, it's religion. So why should they give money to charity?
Yeah, Americans are strange.
I mean, they're a religion based on the teachings of Christ, who was very charitable, but we'll gloss over that.
Yeah, or just the fact that as your average parishioner, member, you do give expecting that the money is going to be used to, if not go to a charity that is just, what you would think of as an average charity you might encounter within a magazine or Googling charity, at the very least, the money will be used to help other members, in that charitable sense. So I do think that when I was giving as a child, I started giving tithing as soon as I got my first 10 cents. I was giving a penny to the church. That was what my parents were teaching me. And so as a kid, and then later as an adult and as a missionary, you're expecting that you're giving and it's really enriching the people around you. It's at least going to build temples. If nothing else, you never in a million years are you thinking it's going toward investing in Apple stock. So
No,
I think
or building a
it was a
shopping
real
mall.
slap in the face.
Yeah. So that for me was the big thing where I realized that this church I was part of is capable of not doing what it says it would be doing or it should be doing, or not doing what we would expect it to be doing. And I felt the need as a member to say something about that, to draw attention to that. And so I did that on a local level. But the thing that got me active online was the way that, again, I hadn't come to a conclusion about whether the church was true or not, or whether the Book of Mormon was true or not. I just discovered that there was a lot of things that we weren't told. And I was particularly upset with the way in which church apologists would try and make those things a non-issue, rather than accepting that they are an issue and having a good faith conversation about how we can come to terms with them, about what they mean for the church, etc. Right? I have no issue with there being multiple accounts of the first vision. I have no issue even with the fact that they were hidden from us, if we're honest about the fact they were hidden from us, and then we have a discussion about what they actually mean. What I don't care for is them saying, well, the church hasn't really ever tried to hide anything from you. You should have read that one 1972 or 1970, whenever it was, Ensign article about multiple First Vision accounts, right? You should have known this. You should have known that. I couldn't stand the victim blaming that apologists would do and the church would engage in. And that got to a particularly intolerable point with the This Is the Show videos that Kwaku and Carden and Brad Whitbeck did for Fair Mormon, which I mean, I don't know how much of an explainer you want me to give your audience on what that all was, but
I've shown some clips of some of them. I don't know if I've shown the clips of what you're exactly referring to, but I'll definitely link it below if you all would like to go watch. But there's definitely a certain group of people who work day and night, so that if anyone Googles, Joseph Smith face in hat, they will have a apologetic result pop up at the top of Google.
Yeah, but these videos were meant to be almost like a sort of, I don't know, SNL type thing of like sketches about why the CES letter's stupid, stuff like that. They're no longer on YouTube. My reactions to them are, but Fair Mormon took them down out of embarrassment because they were just so juvenile and childish and ad hominem. They were just attacking Jeremy Runnels as a person. They were horrible, and I couldn't stand that, and I felt like someone needed to say something, so I did. And Fair Mormon tried to have my videos taken down. When they were scrubbing them off the internet, they tried to have my commentary taken down as well. And I was privy to the email exchanges between Scott Gordon, the head of Fair Mormon, and YouTube's, whoever it was at YouTube at the time within the organization. And the representative of YouTube just kept telling him, no, he has a right to commentate on this stuff. It's fair use. We're not going to take it down. And so they still exist on the internet on my channel. But
okay, well, I will definitely link to those because that I actually hadn't ever heard that before. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So that's what got me started. And then I realized there was other apologetic media the church was putting out, trying to kind of be deceptive about certain things. So I started reacting to that. And then I just more broadly became a commentator on the church and ended up here, I guess.
So you are having your drops in the bucket. I shared recently about putting things on your shelf, that's an ex-Mormon term, putting things on your shelf, and eventually your shelf gets so heavy that it crashes, and that's your faith crisis. It sounds like you had the thing with the Bible, thing with Masonry, thing with the church's finances, which is a pretty huge thing. And you're making your videos. At what point, I guess, as this is all happening to you, one big question I had for this interview is that when all of that happened to me, I decided to leave the church. And long before I made a single video or wrote my book, years before any of that, I wrote my name off. I stopped attending. I did not answer the door for missionaries. So what was it in your mind that made you want to keep attending and participate within the church, the organization, while also criticizing it?
I mean, I'm going to hopefully be able to do a video on this at some point soon, because it is a question so many people have. And it's one of the reasons why people that attack me call me all sorts of things like a bad faith actor, etc., because they will say, well, he doesn't tell you what he does believe. And I think I wrote that off as part of my online position because I thought that's not helpful to the conversation, because I was trying to model a space where it didn't matter what you believed. What it mattered was that for whatever reason you wanted to continue attending the church. It's because you believed but you had all the problems, or because you don't believe but you had family members, or you had a job that relied on it. I just wanted to create a space for people to be able to, I wanted to create big tent Mormonism, right? I didn't do a lot of work on my own beliefs. The thing that is to be said, I guess, is that I tried reading things like The God Delusion, God is Not Great. I started reading new atheist literature and books. And because, again, I'd seen it modeled that, right, you leave the, you discover all these things about the church. So then, okay, the next step is you try and deconstruct religion more broadly. And I just couldn't do it. It didn't sink in. It didn't sit with me. There was always something in me that was that had that belief, that had that Christian belief still, that had that belief in Jesus Christ and the atonement and all those sorts of things. And I then really stopped thinking about that stuff. I was like, okay, well, I'm still happy with those gospel basics. And I stopped thinking about them for years. For the years while I was doing all this, I was like, right, well, they're not important. What's important is the logic and the pragmatics and all these other things I talk about, taking part in the common consent system, proving whether that actually works or not, which, I had this thing with Dan H. Oakes, which we can talk about. It was all about that. And I neglected my own sort of introspective journey, you could say, in order to sit in this space, because I knew deep down that I still believed something. And that was enough for me. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, I think there's a big difference. I think especially as you start digging into what is a ultra bureaucratic corporate entity of the church, it does start to feel like your criticisms of that bureaucratic entity can exist fully separate from any spiritual belief, because when you're talking about SEC filings and financial withholding information, none of that feels very pertinent to a personal faith in a God.
Yeah.
So it does feel like you can kind of engage, or even like looking into history, looking into the things of the CES letter. These are all things with church history, things with first-hand accounts, historical documents. None of that feels like it does have to impact a kind of independent belief system, because it is so separate from spiritual things. It's very data driven in a way. And I will say too, it's interesting to hear, I do think a very common Mormon story is for people to leave, call themselves, I'm an ex-Mormon, I stopped attending church, I moved on with my life. I think a lot of people, though, there are stories too of people saying, I'm going to become a Christian. There are stories of people saying early Mormondom was still true, so I'm going to start a sect. There's this chart, which I'll put on the screen, of all of these different sects that have come from Mormonism, of people saying, well, I don't believe the current church iteration is true, but I believe Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon, or I believe in polygamy and Brigham Young. So it does seem like this moment happens in people's lives where this fundamental part of their identity gets ripped off of them, and then you have to crawl your way into some new thing. And people there's so many different ways to cope with what that means for an individual.
I guess the only other thing I would say is I'm still working through what it is I actually believe now. Particularly, it has had an effect, I would say, on my actual belief being excommunicated. I've talked about it as being quite a spiritually violent thing, and it is. I'm now taking the time to actually reflect on what it is I believe. But throughout my time commentating up until my excommunication, I would just say I was an unorthodox member of the church, but I had belief in the basic fundamentals, the basic doctrines of the church, while being able to criticize the church institutionally and also recognize the problem with apologetic arguments about fundamentals of the church, and being able to hold logically positions that would seem to undermine those. People would look at me and say, well, you went on LDS discussions and you undermine the witnesses and you try and undermine the veracity of the Book of Mormon, all that sort of stuff. I can engage in those logical exercises and I can point out the faulty logic of apologists and all this sort of stuff. And I was able to sit in those spaces and talk about those things. But, I still had my fundamental beliefs, and that's all I can really say, because that's all I've been able to identify within myself. Was kind of my position.
As you are continuing on with making your videos, I assume you're still attending church. And when if you could tell the story of when your formal discipline was initiated.
Yeah, so I was attending church throughout the process as well. So again, I was an active member of the church. I was never lying about that. You know, I was in the Oxford First Ward, which is full of academics. My bishop, for a lot of the time, was a philosophy professor at Oxford. So he and I could have quite intricate conversations about things. I was able to be very conflicted and that not be an issue. You know, I could be conflicted about things and that was okay. And we could, you know, really get into the minutiae of stuff. And that was a great time. And Sunday school, you know, I always talk about how one of my first weeks in Sunday school, someone else brought up the fact that the church had got $100 billion. Wasn't me. I didn't bring it up. Someone else brought it up. So I thought, okay, this is the sort of place I can be. And I was always respectful at church. I would always let other people raise the topic and then we'd talk about it. My bishop never had any concerns about my attendance at church. Generally, it was a nice community and I enjoyed being there. But I would cast opposing votes to the senior leaders of the church. When we were asked to sustain them in meetings, I would oppose. And I would film myself doing so. Those videos are online. Because I oppose the leaders of the church because I believe their behavior when it came to the finances of the church and their behavior when it comes to church history and being honest with us precludes them from acting in a position of prophet, seer, and revelator, and acting in that calling. That was my belief, is if you're not going to be honest with the members of the church and if you're going to hide money, I mean, Satan is the father of lies, and stealing is also pretty big up on the list of things that you're not meant to do.
Yeah, and for anyone who's watching who isn't familiar, it is kind of a very strange aspect of Mormonism where there's something called, basically, it's like holding a vote, where they will say, they'll list the names of the prophet, his counselors, the apostles, local leadership, and the congregation gets an opportunity to sustain or oppose those leaders. Similar to almost like a democracy, it's like a faux democracy moment where they'll say, you know, President Nelson is the prophet of the church. Please sustain him, or, you know, I'm not sure. There is a formal phrase that they're supposed to use, but the members then all do this and say, you know, I vote aye toward this leader. But sometimes people will oppose, but you know, in a typical democracy, you're allowed to do that. But within the church, it's very taboo. It almost never even happens. And when it does, everyone, you know, it's kind of like committing a cardinal sin where you are stared at. You might be, I don't think they've fully kicked anyone out of a meeting for doing that, from what I have. They
No, but they excommunicated a guy called Brian Marchant for opposing the Brethren over the policies around young men not getting to be scout leaders, the young black men, because they couldn't hold the priesthood. And he was excommunicated, I think, a year before then they revoked the priesthood ban.
Interesting. Yeah. So silly.
What happened with him was, I think he met with Gordon B. Hinckley after the meeting. And it used to be that when you're in the tabernacle and whatnot, if you voted opposed, you would meet with an apostle during conference and they would talk to you about your reasons for opposing, right? Now they just send you to your state president. They send you to your local leader and they go, okay, he'll deal with it. And my position with this was, okay, we all kind of know that opposing votes don't work and that they don't matter. But can I prove it? Or can I be more persistent than anyone else and actually get someone with it? And so that's what I did. I kept voting opposed. I kept talking to my state president, my local leaders about my issues. And eventually I found the email addresses of the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 online because they need to be more careful about how they sign up for Family Search. And so I sent them all emails and said, you know, what is to be done when a member has reason to oppose the sustaining of senior church leaders and the reason for their opposition cannot be adequately dealt with at a local level? I was like, what are we meant to do? Because my state president's saying he can't adjudicate this, you know, because I'd presented him evidence that they'd been lying. You know, Daniel H. Oakes lying about electroshock therapy, Jeffrey R. Holland lying about spending money on the Prop 8 campaign, things like this. I put together a document. And so Daniel H. Oakes got back to me out of all the guys I emailed and said, you know, I'd love to reply, but I don't have the time. And I said, well, unfortunately, that doesn't wash, Dallin. And so Brooke Hales, the secretary to the First Presidency, another general authority, he emailed me back and we had a back and forth. And his position was that if it can't be resolved at a local level, the evidence should be sent to the office of the First Presidency for investigation. So then I got my local leaders to go along with that, and we sent a 3,500 word document to the office of the First Presidency containing all the lies of church leaders that they told over the pulpit. Right. That was then investigated by Dallin H. Oakes. Took him 3 months, and then he came back with, "I didn't lie about electroshock therapy, and that's what I promised to help you with." There's more to it. He sent a public study which proved he didn't lie. That public study was actually an article by church apologist institution Fair Mormon, which basically said there's no evidence that he would have known that it was going on, that electroshock therapy was happening while he was president of BYU. And I said, well, that's a really dishonest position. If Dallin H. Oakes is saying that's his position in response, as my state president tried to imply, that's a very dishonest position for Dallin to take, because I sent him evidence that he knew. In the packet I sent him documents that he'd signed where they were discussing electroshock therapy at BYU. Either he didn't read what I sent him, or he's lying to me.
Who was getting the electroshock therapy, if you don't mind sharing with the audience?
Yes, gay individuals, homosexual men predominantly at BYU were being shocked into straightness. Doesn't work.
I'm impressed you got that far. Even that you were able to get someone to even answer, because so often it seems that they're just deny, or not even to deny, but to just remain silent, to exist in the truth of silence,
And so, I mean, he tacitly threw his other brethren under the bus, right? Because his job was, according to him, to investigate the evidence I sent him. So if he has investigated the evidence, the 12 instances of dishonesty or whatever, amongst 7 of the brethren, or 11 or 12 instances of dishonesty amongst 7 of the 15 top leaders of the church, and he comes back with, well, I didn't lie in one of the instances you talked about. What is he saying about all the others? Is he just admitting that if they go unchallenged in a legal proceeding, often if something like that were to go unchallenged, it would just be tacitly admitted, therefore, that it was true, because you've mounted no defense to say it's not. So you could look at that as a tacit admission by Dallin H. Oakes that, yeah, you're right about those things. That's why I'm not addressing them. And then he thought he could try and say he didn't lie. But also that just seems remarkably self-centered by Dallin H. Oakes not to try and defend his brethren. To just be like, well, I didn't lie.
They're all, I feel like they all are just the most self-centered people on earth. They're all just taking the craziest amounts of supplements to try to stay alive long enough to be prophet, I swear.
Well, I think Dallin H. Oakes is desperately trying to outlive Russell M. Nelson, and Russell M. Nelson's just not giving up. The man's, I don't know what's fueling him.
They're over there doing their, old man push-ups just out of spite to try to finally be the prophet.
Yeah, lifting those little 2-pound dumbbells, like, come on, I'm gonna get that.
Oh, well, I'm sure, receiving that communication or really lack thereof of complete communication just was one more item to put on your shelf that you are just kind of, the further you get down this way of thinking, each step you take when you are considering the truth claims of the church, or investigating the church's morality and legality now today, I'm sure it just started to feel even more bleak. And I think for anyone watching, it's important to know as a member, I was really approaching these questions with so much faith. When I was first questioning polygamy, I was trying to look for any reason to justify polygamy, because I so desperately wanted to believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, the church was true, I was, where I needed to be. And you're not approaching, I'm sure, talking even then to Dallin H. Oakes with this chip on your shoulder to say, well, I want you to prove that you're wrong because you're a bad person and I want to out you. I'm sure you're going to him still somewhat earnestly expecting that there is something he's going to say.
Well, yeah, that, or he will apologize.
Yeah.
Because I've made it so clear that, that he is the same man who said the church does not seek apologies, nor does it give them. So, it was a long shot. But, I was going to church on a Sunday. I was participating in Sunday worship. I was taking the sacrament. I was praying. I was reading scriptures. I was continuing to enact my faith as personally as I could. I'd had to kind of withdraw into myself, as I said, to be like, right, well, my personal faith has to be very personal, because I'm not going to let it get involved in this other stuff I'm dealing with. But I'm still wanting to go to the temple. Like I said, I would still go to the temple now if I could. I'm still wanting to go. And I naively think, okay, well, he has lied to me, or he has certainly failed in what he said he would do for me. But then I've done my part, so surely now my bishop and stake president should let me go to the temple. Because when I say I can't sustain them, I'm not just anyone saying I can't sustain them. I'm the person who's taken evidence of dishonesty to them, and they have refused to investigate, or they've refused to do what they were meant to do. So I shouldn't, the burden then shouldn't be on me to have to sustain them after that. It should be, okay, Nemo gets an exemption from having to sustain them because it's very clear that they can't answer his questions. They've legitimized his questions by investigating them. They can't answer them. So they're unanswerable, so why should we hold him to a position where he has to? Does that make sense? I mean, it was naive, but I thought, fine, okay, I should be able to just get on then and live my personal faith, because if they don't have answers, then the answers clearly aren't there, so I should be able to get on with it. A common consent is clearly broken. I can just get on and then live my personal faith and continue to be a critic, because I believe that criticism is where improvement comes from. That's kind of one of my values, is criticizing an organization that you're part of is one of the ways to make it better.
Well, and it's like that person that you noted that was outspoken against Black boys being able to be involved with Boy Scouts. They changed the rule right after that happened. And right after, there was a big wave of feminism where women were outspoken, and then suddenly women are praying in conference. So it really does, if you look at the pattern, the church 100% does respond to criticism. They just excommunicate the critic and then enact some 10% version of what the critic was asking for to appease the people who were riled up by the critic. So criticism, and I think criticism has worked from within, especially the more high profile and the more active the person is as a critic, the more they take with them on the way out, I think, because it's hard to look at someone like you who was attending, was participating, was reading the scriptures, and say, okay, look how evil this person is, when it's so obvious that you're just a fully participatory member with some criticisms, versus, it's not like you were doing drugs, being an adulterer, any number of these other things that are more objectively immoral. You were just using your mouth to say things they didn't like. So when someone like you gets excommunicated, it really shows where the values lie. It's not about morality. It's about kicking out dissenters.
Yeah. Well, because what's crazy is I was part of a team that worked on the inside to get background checks for people working with children in the UK. Wow. And we achieved that.
That's amazing.
That, I wasn't the head of that group. I was a supportive member of that group. The credit really goes to Sarah and Jane from 21st Century Saints. They really pushed that. But I was part of helping them achieve that. So, we did achieve a shift and a change. And so it wasn't all fruitless, but it is difficult to be excommunicated when it is seemingly because they don't like the things you say. Off the back of that, one of the individuals involved got a stake calling as the stake safeguarding specialist, right? That was her calling, to help people make sure that background checks were being done and that policy was being devised and strategies devised to keep children safe and all that sort of stuff. I was part of setting her apart. So the Mormon concept of when someone gets a calling, a couple of priesthood holders put their hands on their head and they kind of give this person a preparatory blessing and put them into that position or that job. And it became known that I was involved in setting her apart, and from that moment onward I wasn't allowed to use the priesthood anymore, but for an odd reason, that I couldn't obtain a temple recommend, therefore I wasn't temple worthy, therefore I wasn't worthy to hold the priesthood. Which, there's plenty of people out there who are exercising the priesthood who don't have a temple recommend. But I was, that was something that happened to me, seemingly in response to being involved publicly and using the priesthood, because they didn't want to see someone like me as being able to do orthodox things in the church, like participate in the setting apart of an individual, like blessing the sacrament. I blessed the sacrament one time after that, because there was a change of bishop and he wanted me to, so I did. And then there was a bit of I probably shouldn't have done that because I'm not allowed to, but I was willing to and did. I was participating in Mormonism.
It's really so sad to see the church throw people out like you, because obviously you really do want to make it better, and it's just it's the way you're going about it that they find so objectionable. But obviously they are throwing out someone who is willing to invest hours and hours and hours of their life into making things better for members. It almost makes the church move from this category of just not the best organization to evil organization, because it feels so specifically pointed at kicking out really awesome people who are trying to make it better. You know, I'm not sure why you would kick out someone who's trying to make kids safer. I'm not sure why you would kick out someone who's trying to make it so an organization is more transparent. And the only answer to me seems to be it's because it's kind of evil. You know, and maybe I have usually the most disfavorable takes for this church, so I'm sure there are lots of other takes, but I just don't, you know, as you're describing just how much you're doing for this church, and that they still kicked you out and kind of systematically removed power from you. I don't. It's kind of inexcusable.
Well, like, because I think as well, I think one of the real tipping points for them was when I went on Lad Bible and spoke honestly as a member of the church, right? I went and did an interview with a British media outlet called Lad Bible, where I sat down and I answered questions about the church. Rapid fire. I sat there for an hour and they asked me question after question about the church. And, you know, at one point I said, you know, Warren Jeffs and Joseph Smith are more similar in their practice of polygamy than maybe the church would like to admit. And I talked about them having a similar number of wives, and that wasn't quite right. And, you know, there was a whole, you know, Ward Radio went after me and were like, oh, look, see, he's just lying now. And I was like, oh, I've talked about that in a recent video. Yeah, I got that wrong, but it was corrected after the fact. And so it's all good. And the other thing was like about garments going like to your elbow and to your knee. And they're like, oh, it doesn't go to your elbow. It goes like to your mid, like upper arm. I was like, okay, fine, cool. If that's your criticism of what I have to say, then it's all good. But yeah, I was kind of doing sort of what you do in many ways. I was trying to talk about Mormonism openly and honestly to a non-Mormon audience, and you do it much better than I did, but I did my best, and the church really didn't like it, because the problem is I think they felt like they couldn't control what I was saying. The only way they could control the fact that I was still a member was by kicking me out. And I kind of challenged the church maybe a year or so ago and said, look, if you want me to stop, you're going to have to kick me out, because I'm going to just keep doing this. Like, you're going to have to take it from me. I joined this church at 8. Everyone celebrated that as my choice when I was 8, even though I have some thoughts about how much that was actually my choice now, looking back and looking at other 8-year-olds now, thinking, you know, should it be something that happens when we're older? Because I don't think you can appreciate the gravity of what you're entering into as an 8-year-old. So that was why I was saying, you know, everyone celebrated that as my choice when I was 8. And now that I'm choosing not to leave and instead to stay and to try and live in this unorthodox way, and to, you know, try and make a space for people to stay, but not be just what everyone seems to have to be, like to be ultra orthodox. If the church wants me to stop trying to live that way, I'm not going to stop, because that's how I want to live. So they're going to have to take it away. They're going to have to remove it from me. And they did.
So tell us from the beginning to the end of the excommunication process. And if you could, a lot of the problem with Mormonism is there's so many words and so much jargon, that is inaccessible to a non-Mormon audience. And some of it is even inaccessible to a Mormon audience, specifically around something like excommunication, because it's a very secret, hush-hush thing that happens to people. So if, while you share, you could share a little bit too about the explanation of the overview as well of what these councils mean, who's allowed to participate, what the implications of each of these steps are. So I know that's a big thing to ask, because you're telling kind of a personal story along with,
I'll do my best,
what this all means for, you know, how the architecture behind it all works. Yeah, I would love to hear. And even coming from me, I've like I said at the top, rarely heard stories of excommunication or spoken to people who've been excommunicated. So I think it's a really important story, even just as an explanation of how the church works.
All right, well, we'll start with a slightly tongue-in-cheek explanation of what the Church Handbook of Instructions is, which is it's the 5th volume of church scripture, right? You have the Bible, you have the Book of Mormon, you have the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and then you have the Church Handbook of Instructions. That's like the standard works of Mormonism. I have genuinely heard the Church Handbook quoted over the pulpit in a talk, which is just like it's scripture. It's bizarre. Anyway, the LDS Church has a handbook that lays out the do's and don'ts of Mormonism from a logistical perspective, right? Can you have candles in a meeting house? No. Through to what hand should you take the sacrament with? You should take it with your right hand, all those sorts of things. Yes, so the handbook of instructions lays out a lot of things, including things like what they call church membership councils, which used to be called church disciplinary councils. So that's what I was invited to, and we'll get through the invitation to it in a moment. But in the church handbook, it lays out things that can cause you to be brought to church discipline. Things like adultery, things like financial fraud, things like, for a while, homosexuality, and then, and still engaging in homosexual behavior will get you brought before a church disciplinary council. One of them is apostasy. Now, I had raised concerns with my church leaders right from the beginning that I was worried about accusations of apostasy. I was worried about getting excommunicated for apostasy. I didn't want it to happen, but I was worried about it because I'd looked at the handbook definitions and I'd looked at how they could be applied to me. So people will use that to say, well, you knew you were an apostate, you admitted you were an apostate, so why are you surprised you're excommunicated? But that's not how it went down. I said, look, if you look at the handbook, I can see how those would be applied to me, and I want reassurance that that's not your position, right? That you understand what it is I'm actually doing. And I was getting that reassurance from my church leaders. Even after I flew out to Fairview, Texas, to challenge the church's building of a temple based on lies about our religious beliefs on steeple height, and I went there and said, that's not true. I got back and my state president was like, yeah, I'm not pointing to Texas as something that's of particular concern. That's not a concern for us. And that was in sort of July of 2024. So for almost 4 years of my YouTube channel, all that sort of stuff, my state president said, well, there's nothing I've seen on the YouTube channel that would worry me and all that sort of stuff. So I was constantly in communication with my church leaders to avoid a charge of apostasy. And I figured when it eventually came, because I was pretty sure that I would get excommunicated at some point, I thought it would come with, you're starting to step over a line now. I think you either need to dial it back or we need to have a conversation. Because I sent letters so within a sort of geographic area, there's your church leaders, and then there's also the High Council, which is 12 individuals who kind of travel around the stake or the collection of congregations. They travel around them and they give talks and whatnot. And I'd sent emails including them with my concerns and my challenges about the church and all that sort of stuff. And when my state president had confronted me about those in the past, he'd left reassured that I wasn't doing it to challenge their faith. I was doing it because I thought they should legitimately be involved. And he asked me not to anymore. And later on, and so I didn't, right? So I was playing their game. So then imagine my shock when, out of the blue, after going on Lad Bible and after going on BBC Radio talking about being a member of the church, I then all of a sudden get a letter in the post summoning me to a church disciplinary council. I have the letter if you want me to.
Sure.
Do you want me to grab any excerpts from it? Yeah. Of course, I framed it.
As you should.
So it says, the stake presidency is holding a membership council in your behalf. And it says the council will be held and it originally was at 10 a.m. on the 23rd of September 2024 at Reading Chapel. It turned out not to be at that time and date. We changed it. It says the council will consider your public statements as well as reported conduct that together suggest you have A, repeatedly acted in clear and deliberate public opposition to the church, its doctrine and its leaders, and B, engaged in a pattern of intentionally working to weaken the faith and activity of church members, either of which, if established, could constitute apostasy. And I was upset because I had, worked with them all this time to try and avoid charges of apostasy, because I could see how it could be interpreted that I have acted in public opposition to the church because I've voted opposed publicly. I've told other people to vote opposed if they feel to do so. But I don't think that should be excommunicatable because we're asked if we oppose or not. They're asking us the question. We should be able to answer with good conscience without fear of church discipline. And similarly, stating that it's my intention to weaken the faith and activity of church members, that's never been my intention. I understand that some of the things I put out there could be challenging to other people's faith because they were challenging to mine in some ways, but it was not my intention. I've never told people to leave the church. I said once, and this was brought up in my excommunication, and then we'll go back to the logistics of the council. But one of the things that said in my excommunication was from an interview with John Dehlin in the early days, where I said, I've led people out of the church, and I worry what will happen if the church knows about that, or that the church knows about that, what they'll do to me. And poor confused 23-year-old me didn't understand then what I understand now, which is there is a difference between leading someone out of the church and sharing with them information about the church that causes them to leave. Right? There's a difference between the message and the messenger. I didn't
Mhm.
understand that then, but I get that now. My stake president still doesn't understand that, it seems. If telling people what the church has done with their money causes them to lose faith in the church, is that my fault for telling them, or is it the church's fault for doing that with their money?
Yeah.
Right? That's the position I hold now. So anyway, so I get that letter, and the stake president then invites me to a meeting to discuss it, in which he refuses to give me any of the evidence they have against me. Just refuses. So I enter my disciplinary council not knowing what it was that they would bring forward in evidence against me, which was troubling. I kind of just expressed to him that I was deeply disappointed that he had reassured me all this time. I found out later. He kind of nudged me towards the communications with the High Council. He wouldn't tell me exactly what in those communications was his issue, but he nudged me towards it and said, yeah, I think it's those emails. And I said to him, what, the emails that you told me weren't a problem once you understand why I sent them, those ones. So that's why I felt the betrayal that I did. And that's why I found it difficult, is because a leader who was reassuring me that I wasn't in apostasy and that he wasn't concerned, all of a sudden, after I made a couple of media appearances, used things that he'd reassured me about previously as grounds to then try and excommunicate me. That I think that needs to be made clear. We argued about when it should be, because they wanted it at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning. When has a church meeting ever been held at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning, Alyssa?
Never.
Never.
Yeah.
That was at the request of the area leaders. So the church is divided up into global areas, and each of those areas has leadership. So I fall under the Europe North area. So the Europe North area leadership had requested the morning because if any media were to be present, they wanted it to be light outside. They didn't want dark optics. That is, I kid you not, the reason why it was at that time. Yeah. So they knew this was going to draw attention, me being excommunicated.
And they used to call this a council of love. They used to call it excommunication, a council of love, because it was the most loving thing to do, to excommunicate someone when they'd been sinful, because it gives them the opportunity to get rebaptized. And it's almost like they borrowed the doctrine of blood atonement to say, if someone's been evil, you should also kill them, because then they've atoned for their sins through their own death. It is basically taking that same ethos and putting it onto excommunication. But I do feel like, hearing this, we need to make sure the PR optics of your excommunication are the best possible. For us, is very against this idea of this council of love, which is supposed to come to you and say, we've seen you in sin and we want to help you repent, instead of, we want to make sure that if the BBC is there, they get a good picture, a not so evil as it's happening in the dark picture.
Yeah. And there were film crews there. If we look to the day of the event, because then we arranged for it to be on a Thursday night at 7:30, so that my wife could attend because she works. Film crews came and filmed, and there was a candlelight vigil outside. But the church had made it clear that no one was allowed on church property other than those that had been pre-approved. So they weren't even allowed in the parking lot to support me or whatever. They really clamped this down. But people still turned up. There was a big banner outside, and there's photos of that doing the rounds and whatnot. So these people came, and John DeLynn did a live vigil online and stuff like that. So yeah, on the day, I turned up and I went in my white temple suit because I wanted to symbolize that I still felt worthy to go to the temple, and I still felt that I was worthy to go back and be there, and to symbolize that I didn't think I'd committed any moral sin that would warrant my excommunication. And then we get into the building, which is the thing that many people don't know about. And this is, the stuff that your audience is going to be particularly interested in, because that's, there's shots that will come out, because there's a video being made about this by a media outlet who were there getting all their footage. So these shots will come out, but there's shots of me through the gates just walking into the building, and that's it. You lose sight of me, then I'm gone. So what happened in the building was, some of the people that were allowed to come in and support me, like my parents, were there, and they were set up with refreshments in the sort of Relief Society area. And then the council happened not in the High Council room, which in a stake center is the big room with the long table for all those 12 men who go around the congregations to all sit in for meetings. Didn't happen in there. It happened in the stake president's office. So we were all cramped up into this tiny little office to have this meeting, because my stake president refused to let the High Council be present. Normally, if the member requests it, the High Council can be there. And they're meant to be 6 of them for you and 6 of them against you, sort of a biblical thing, right? And they draw lots to decide who's on what side.
Wow.
And they're there to make sure that you are, adequately heard and adequately prosecuted, as it were, right? So they weren't there. And I think it's strange that they weren't there, because if I was charged with engaging in a pattern of intentionally working to weaken the faith and activity of church members, and that was centering around emails I sent to the High Council, why were the members of the High Council not there? So I could then ask, okay, well, which one of you had your faith and testimony weakened then, or your faith and activity weakened? What was it about what I said to you caused that to happen? And again, there was no evidence presented in my excommunication hearing as to exactly how I had weakened their faith or activity, which was strange. So I get into the room, and the people that are in there are the stake president and his 2 counselors. So 3 men there, the top leadership of this sort of geographical area of the church. You've got the stake clerk who's there to take notes and record things down. Then my wife came in as one of my witnesses, one of my character witnesses, because you're allowed to bring people to speak on your behalf. Someone else came in from the ward to speak on my behalf as well. And 2 people sent letters in, one of whom, I think he's spoken about it publicly, Jim Bennett, if you know who Jim Bennett is. He is a Mormon apologist, but also does a podcast where he speaks to someone who's left the church, and they have their views and whatnot. He wasn't in favor of me being excommunicated either, and he is a temple recommending holding member of the church. And he said, no, I don't think so. He sent a letter to my stake president. So I presented this evidence to them, and people would speak to them after they had presented their evidence against me, which took about 15 minutes. And that was the first time I heard any of what I was being accused of, really, other than the allusions to the sort of High Council letters. And so we won't get into what exactly the charges were, because, as I've said before, they create a bit of legal trouble.
Okay.
Some of what's going on, particularly because the church breached my privacy by using private correspondence between me and another individual.
Yeah, I will say often in making some of my TikTok videos about the way the church collects information, I'll have a lot of people from the UK who will say, I hope they're not doing that over here because it's illegal over here. So I'm not surprised to hear that, because I do think they skirt the law in some places.
And again, nothing in those personal communications I defended at the time, nothing in those personal communications was intended to weaken the faith and activity of any church member. It wasn't public opposition to the church because it was a private communication. So they can't find me guilty of clear and deliberate public opposition to the church because it was a private conversation. Nothing in that conversation was intended to weaken anyone's faith or activity in the church.
Yeah, from what you're describing, it's kind of similar in the spirit of, we have this oppose and sustain system that is literally just for show, this trial where you get some people for you and some people against you, and they're presenting evidence. It's like they are giving the illusion of having some sort of fair law and justice situation, when obviously this is also just an internal thing. This has nothing to do with the actual real legal system in any country. A church disciplinary council is always just something that is completely internal. And obviously also they're not even allowing everyone who's supposed to be there, or the press, or, it's not, in a typical legal proceeding, other people would be allowed in the courtroom. So it's just the illusion of justice.
A couple of other things I think that are really important to mention about this are that the letter I got explicitly states you're not allowed to bring legal counsel. So they make that very clear. My stake president has presented himself to me as a lawyer. So as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know, he's a lawyer. I presented 8,500 words of rebuttal to him. But before I was even allowed in the door, I had to sign an agreement to say that I wouldn't record the meeting in any way. That I wouldn't make written or audio notes of any kind.
That's crazy.
I was allowed to make written notes as long as I destroyed them and couldn't take them out of the room. But yeah, the whole thing was completely sealed, and they forced me to sign this. Otherwise, they said, if you won't sign it, the council will just occur in your absence. So that is standard practice. If you want to attend your own disciplinary council, if you want to attend your own membership council in the church, you have to sign that agreement to say that you won't record it and you won't make any notes.
Crazy.
Otherwise, they'll just say, we'll do it without you. Which is just mad. So I signed that, and I went into the meeting. I presented all my evidence, and it took them 72 hours or so before they kind of came back and went, yeah, no, you've been excommunicated. And then through UK data law, I was able to request a copy of the transcript that was sent to Salt Lake about why I was excommunicated. And I haven't gone into this anywhere yet, but all I will say is in there are untruthful statements about my missionary service, for example. There's statements in there about how I returned off my mission early, which I didn't. I was released honorably at the time I was planning to be released. So they
Wow.
painted this picture to Salt Lake that I, was this troubled person. They, made accusations of me being aggressive.
Crazy.
So, yeah.
They're just like, I'm sure that after you left, a few of them got together and they're like, oh, added something in there about him being aggressive. That just sounds so. Even what you described about them having refreshments, it's like having, I don't know, something about that's such a strange, we're going to excommunicate this guy, but make sure you bring some brownies. It's just,
Yeah.
I don't know. It sounds so. You're very brave, in my opinion, for kind of putting up with that, putting up with so much opposition from your leaders, from going to that thing and having to sit through them slandering you and saying you're a bad person. And I mean, I'm sure my anxiety would have been out of control. That's for sure.
Well, if you want to get a sense for what it was like, I actually watched the film Oppenheimer the other day.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
So the trial he's put through, where it's a trial in all but name. They've got a guy who's a prosecutor, but not really a prosecutor, but he's able to act like one, and he just sits there and takes it. I watched it yesterday for the first time since my excommunication, and I was like, that was very reminiscent of what that was like for me.
Yeah.
They come in and they have got this predetermined outcome in mind. It's very clear that I'm there because they want to take my membership off me, right? They're not there to determine whether that should happen. They're there because they want that to happen, and they're trying to justify it. And I don't think anything I could have said. One of my witnesses asked them straight up, is there anything we can say tonight that will actually make a difference? And they tried to say, yes, no, of course. I don't personally believe it. I think it was very clear what the outcome of that would be. But I engaged with it in good faith or naivety or whatever you want to call it, just like I have throughout the rest of my time in the church since I became unorthodox, since about 2020. I took it seriously and I said, right, I'm going to treat it as though this could actually come out good. I won't be shocked if it doesn't, but I'm going to hold that space for this could come out. I could be the person to beat it. I could, not from a pride point of view, but the right thing could actually happen. The church might surprise me and do the right thing here, and so I'm going to give them the opportunity to do it. And ultimately, they chose not to take the opportunity. But you can appeal the decision, so I did, and I appealed it to the First Presidency of the church, and they came back and went, "No, we uphold the decision," and that was signed by. That was in letter form.
I saw the letter that I think you posted it on Reddit, which I'll also put on the screen here. But I was surprised to see they, each one of them goes and hand writes it. And it is kind of crazy to consider the fact that they're fully aware of your situation. They're fully aware of what's transpired with the excommunication. And they are just the final nail on the coffin to say, we get to decide this, not you.
Yeah. And Dallin H. Oakes has been aware of me since at least sort of 2022.
Yeah.
Since I had that run-in with him where he failed to do what he promised me he would do. And I think when I made that public, I don't think he liked that. And some have speculated that it may have been personal, that he decided I should be excommunicated. I mean, another thing that happened around that time is there was a leak of some church training for bishops and stake presidents. Or certainly for state presidents. Basically, what Dallin H. Oakes was saying, then we need to have more disciplinary councils. And I don't know whether it was perhaps that my stake president saw and went, okay, well, I've had this guy in limbo for a while. Maybe I should actually excommunicate him.
Yeah, it seems like the timeline of your Lad Bible interview and your YouTube channel and your appearance in Texas, I feel, all of those things culminating together, it seems like they were okay with you being outspoken, but they weren't okay with you being outspoken and successfully outspoken on such a public level. Yeah. So when you walked out of that church meeting, I guess, church, when you walked out
Mhm.
of that fucked up situation, how did it feel to just exit the door?
The picture of me that does the rounds online is me walking out of that door. Yeah, I think you can see it on my face. You could see it certainly in the footage of me afterwards. I gave a little statement afterwards, and I also spoke to John Delin in the car. I spoke on that live stream, and I was quite shocked by the way they'd invaded my privacy, the way that they did. I was quite just rattled by the whole experience. I'm known I think online for my composure and my ability to do difficult things like some of the footage of me voting opposed. I'm sat on the stand as a member of the state choir at state conference, and then I stand up and vote opposed looking out at 500 people, and I can do that, and that's okay.
Or even speaking, you spoke at in Fairview, Texas. You went to the
Yeah.
the pulpit or the lectern and said,
Hmm.
even though they're saying that the height of a temple steeple is very important, I'm a member and it's not important. And there are members in that group of people who are come to try to
Hmm.
get the government to change their mind. So, I
Yeah.
mean,
There's 2,500 Mormons outside dressed in white t-shirts
wow.
who wanted the temple to be built. I had to be taken out of the back exit of the building because they were all out the front, and they were like,
Wow.
let's take you out this way just to be
I mean,
sure.
that is much different than sitting in front of a camera. So props to you for
Yeah.
showing up in person and doing some of these things.
Well, yeah, but I mean, these things, I don't find them particularly difficult. I'm able to do them. But the excommunication was something I think so personally and spiritually violent. It cut to the core of me. I was sat in a room being accused of things that I knew I could defend, but I knew the defense would fall on deaf ears and hard hearts, and it did. And so I think for me, it was a real moment of realization that when push came to shove, these men would be loyal to the institution over their sort of pastoral responsibility to me as my church leaders, right? My feelings, my needs as a member of the organization would be secondary to whatever dictate they had received from Salt Lake saying you got to get rid of this guy, or from whatever training they'd received saying we need to have more councils or whatever it is. And that was tough because I'd always found some acceptance within my community, particularly in Oxford being the sort of nuanced place that it was. And so to finally be quite concretely rejected by my community, I think hit me quite hard.
Well, like I said, I think going through all of that was very brave, and I'm sorry it happened. I think a lot can be said about. I've often heard people say, "Well, I can make change from within the church," but they're not actually really doing anything to make the change from within the church. It's just, it's almost like they are giving themselves permission to be a more liberal Mormon or a more nuanced Mormon, and
Mhm.
say, well, me existing within the walls of the church is me making change. And I always find those types of explanations for membership to be quite thin, but I feel like what you're saying, which is I'm going to be in the organization and try to change it and actually really do a lot to try to change it, is very valiant.
Yeah.
And I think it makes a big difference for people who want to see these changes, and for especially for the children who are now going to grow up in the church, to be able to have some of these changes which you instituted,
Mhm.
or for active believing members who probably knew you personally, who see you as a really good person who has now been excommunicated merely for speaking, not for any moral wrongdoing. You didn't murder anyone.
Yeah.
You just you
No.
sat in front of a camera and opened your mouth, and that is
Yeah.
enough. And we didn't talk about what excommunication really means is not just that you can't be a member. It means that everything you're promised in the temple is revoked from you. All of the saving ordinance of baptism revoked from you. What Mormons believe is the gift of the Holy Spirit, and the ability to receive revelation through the Spirit, revoked from you. So it is a kind of spiritual death,
Hmm.
because any promise you've ever been given by the church through these ordinances is completely revoked.
Hmm.
In addition to, I don't know, were you married in the temple?
Yeah.
Yeah, so in addition,
Yeah.
because you were married in the temple, they've essentially spiritually divorced you from your wife without your consent,
Hmm.
because you will, after
Yeah.
excommunication, you will no longer be able to be married with that person in the afterlife. So they've instituted excommunication is instituting a divorce, which is kind of
Yeah.
bonkers and so cruel to realize.
And I did a video recently called What is Mormon Hell and Why I'm Probably Going There. And I think what's less known, and a lot of people are still pushing back on me over this, and I could be wrong about it, but I think the scriptures are fairly clear, is that apostasy specifically, not just excommunication, but apostasy specifically, if you read the footnotes of the Doctrine and Covenants, and if you really look into who has suffered themselves to be overcome by the power of the devil, right? Who then becomes a son of perdition. That's how it works. A son of perdition is someone that is going to outer darkness, which is the Mormon equivalent of hell. It's not even one of the kingdoms of heaven. The murderers and whoremongers, they're all going to like the bottom degree of heaven, but it's still a degree of heaven whose glory defies all description, according to the scripture, right? They're still going there. The Hitlers of this world going there. Apostates, or sons of perdition, we'll say, sons of perdition are definitely going to outer darkness, cut off from the presence of God entirely and the presence of all those things, and sent to outer darkness. And it defines those who are the sons of perdition as those who have allowed themselves to be overcome by the devil. And if you look at the footnote there, it says, see apostasy. So that, to me, makes it pretty clear that if you have been convicted of apostasy by the church, which I have, that means I'm going to outer darkness because I have allowed myself to be overcome by the devil, which means I'm a son of perdition, which means I'm going to outer darkness. I've laid that case out. People disagree. I think because they have a more universalist view of the afterlife and they want to convince themselves that only like a couple of people are going to outer darkness and Mormons are really lovely and inclusive. But in reality, the scripture seems to say to me that if you're an apostate, which is what I was convicted of, that means you're going to outer darkness.
Yeah.
And that's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, outer darkness is Mormon afterlife theology is so complex and strange and nonsensical as well, but I do feel like outer darkness specifically is basically the literal worst fate possible. And like you said, I completely agree. Hitler himself will not go to outer darkness. He will just go to the lowest kingdom, which, by the way, Joseph Smith said the lowest kingdom of heaven is so beautiful that if you saw it, you would kill yourself to get there. So even someone as bad as, a genocidal maniac gets to go there, but you, who've been convicted of apostasy by the church, depending on how you read into the doctrine, might not be able to, would go to the true hell of Mormonism, which is insane.
So that's what apostasy means. That's what excommunication means. It means, I went to church for the final time the Sunday after my disciplinary council because the decision wasn't made on the night. So I went to church because I was still a member of the church at that point. I was like, cool, great, okay, I'll still go to church. And then I got the letter through from my state president saying, no, that's it. And if you read through the letter, we won't now, but if you read through the letter that makes the decision about me, it's nonsense because it simultaneously says I wasn't excommunicated for speaking out, having opinions. I was excommunicated because those opinions were too convincing. It's like, okay. That seems rather nonsensical.
Yeah, too potent.
You were too right. And then at that point, things like, because I have this argument with people, I was having a discussion with someone the other day. Mormonism has a very legalistic sense of who is a member and who isn't, right? If you are baptized a Mormon, you could not believe any of it. You could even do things that, should your leaders choose to, they could excommunicate you for. You could drink, you could smoke, you could do all those things, and you could still say you're a Mormon. You could still say that you're a member of the church because there's a very strict barrier to entry, which is baptism, and that makes you a member of record. And the reason that that's valid is because the church themselves will choose to keep including you as a member despite your complete inactivity or any of those things, for the purpose of their own numbers. So if it's good enough for the organizational church to continue to accept you, even in your complete disavowal of the church, then you can, if you want, continue to claim yourself as a member of the church. Right? That wasn't my situation. I was way more active than that, and I was way more believing than that. But it is just a very specific legalistic position. You're either a member of the church or you're not. You've either got a church membership record or you don't. And this is to open up for your non-Mormon audience the fact that one of the things that really hit me very hard was when I tried to log into my church account online and couldn't anymore. It was gone. Wow. When people looked at the church app for our ward, for our congregation, and see that I'm there listed next to my wife, brackets non-member, stuff like that hits quite hard.
Yeah, it's very, you might hear excommunicated and they're like, I'm going to stop attending, but there are so many different little tendrils of what that now represents, the implications that aren't
Yeah.
as obvious on their face, that when you go to just do your little login on your little portal and they don't, they revoked your right to do that. I mean, even for me, I was trying to research my family history and I used to be able to log into Family Search and see just this wealth of information. And for when my husband and I got married, I was linked to him in Family Search as his wife, and now I'm not there. I've disappeared. He looks like he's single, basically, and I no longer have access to all of that information because I don't have a portal, an active, online account anymore that allows me to see that. So
Mm.
there are so many random little ways that it kind of is a gut punch to, or even I did a video about garments, and you can buy garments with an inactive temple recommend, but not with, like, I don't have an inactive temple recommend. I
Mhm.
just don't have a temple recommend. So my husband
Yeah.
even can still go.
And you're told you can't wear garments anymore when you're excommunicated. They're like, you cannot wear them. You're not allowed to wear them anymore.
Watch me. Sure, you still.
So I had to go out and buy underwear. Like,
So weird.
it's just
Yeah,
mad.
you got excommunicated, so you have to
Yeah,
go
like,
underwear shopping.
yeah, 27 years old, and you're like, right, okay, what's good underwear? Yeah.
Dear Google, what should I do? Yeah. So now, Nemo, that you are excommunicated, you've Googled what underwear to wear.
Mm.
What are you looking forward to for the rest of your life? What comes next for Nemo?
Well, it's a good question, and for those that want to know, they're going to have to go to my channel where you and I are going to discuss that. I believe the video is going to be called something like "How to Be Ex-Mormon" with Alyssa Grenfell. Like, I've got an expert here who's going to talk me through how to be ex-Mormon. So we'll be discussing what's next for me, and what life outside of Mormonism can look like over there. So make sure to come check it out.
Yeah, and if you're watching this now, by the time this video is posted, that interview on Nemo's channel will be live. I'll link it below. This is a screenshot of what the thumbnail looks like. Definitely encourage you to go over and check that out, even if you have never been ex-Mormon, just to hear, if you want to hear some more of my story, or if you've recently had a faith crisis. I recently had someone email me and said that they were a devout Muslim their whole life, and my ex-Mormon content helped them question their own faith and ultimately decide to leave their own religion. So for anybody who's going through any sort of religious transition or just curious to hear more of my story or Nemo's story, definitely consider checking that interview out. If you like this interview, please like this video, subscribe to my channel. I have a new video every single week about Mormon doctrine, history, my personal experiences with it. And so thank you again to Nemo for coming on the channel, for sharing what is such a crazy experience with questioning and challenging and ultimately being excommunicated from the church. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Oh, no worries. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, and as always, I will see you all next week.